Christmas was always my favorite time of year, but that particular winter, everything changed. That year, something happened. Something I still can't explain. Something I can't forget no matter how hard I try. It all started when I was 12 and my dad built me a treehouse in our backyard. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was mine. It stood tall in the old oak tree that bordered the woods behind our house. During the warmer months, I spent hours up there reading, drawing, and sometimes just watching the birds. But in winter, the treehouse became a lonely silhouette in the frosty yard, a place forgotten until the snow melted. That December, the snowstorm came early. It blanketed our town in white, covering everything in a cold, suffocating silence. I remember sitting in my room that evening, staring out at the treehouse. The wind made the bare branches sway, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. I didn't think much of it until I noticed something strange. The treehouse wasn't empty. From my window, I could see a dim, flickering light coming from inside. At first, I thought maybe my dad had left something up there, a flashlight maybe, but as I watched, the light seemed to move, shifting from one side of the treehouse to the other. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a reflection from the snow. But deep down, I knew better. I decided to check it out. I don't know why. I guess I thought I'd feel braver if I confronted it. Grabbing my jacket and a flashlight, I made my way outside. The snow crunched under my boots, the icy air stinging my face. As I approached the tree, the light in the treehouse flickered and then went out. I froze. The treehouse was completely dark now, but I could feel something watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the ladder slowly, each step creaking under my weight. My flashlight beam wobbled as my hands shook. When I reached the top, I hesitated before pushing open the small wooden door. The air inside the treehouse was icy, far colder than outside. My breath formed clouds as I exhaled, and the beam of my flashlight illuminated the small space. It was empty, or at least it seemed that way. The books and toys I'd left behind were still there undisturbed. Then I noticed the footprints. They were muddy, smudging the wooden floorboards, and they led to the far corner of the treehouse. But there was no one there. My heart pounded as I followed the trail with my flashlight. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. There was no response, but suddenly, the treehouse door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, spinning around, my flashlight shaking wildly. The room felt darker now, like the shadows were closing in. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. "Leave." I froze, unable to move, my flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the empty room. The voice came again, louder this time. "Leave now." I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I bolted for the ladder, practically sliding down it in my haste. As I reached the bottom, I glanced back up at the treehouse. For a split second, I saw a figure, a dark, shadowy silhouette standing in the window. I ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My parents were in the living room, oblivious to what had just happened. I tried to tell them, but they dismissed it as my imagination. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring out my window at the treehouse, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again. But the treehouse remained dark and still. The next morning, I decided to go back. I wanted to prove to myself that it was all in my head, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But when I climbed into the treehouse, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the walls were words, messy, jagged letters that spelled out, "Asterisk, this is my place now." Asterisk. I ran back to the house. too scared to tell my parents what I'd seen. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd hear faint whispers coming from the backyard at night. Even though no one was there, the lights in the house would flicker, and cold spots would appear in random places. Then one night, I woke up to a tapping sound at my bedroom window. My room is on the second floor, so it couldn't have been a person, or at least not a normal person. Terrified, I pulled the covers over my head and tried to ignore it, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I worked up the courage to look. Standing outside my window was a shadowy figure, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I screamed and the figure vanished, leaving behind only frost on the glass. My parents rushed in, but when I tried to explain, they didn't believe me. The final straw came a week later. I was walking home from school when I saw smoke rising from the backyard. I ran to the treehouse, and to my horror, it was on fire. The flames were unnaturally dark, almost black, and they didn't spread to the tree itself. We never found out how the fire started. My dad claimed it was an electrical issue, but there were no wires in the treehouse. After that, the strange occurrences stopped, but I still can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting for me to return to its place. To this day, I refuse to go near tree houses, especially at night, because I know somewhere out there, the shadow is still waiting. Tree houses are supposed to be places of adventure, imagination, and childhood joy, a place where the world feels far away and safe. But for me, our tree house became something else entirely. It became a place I fear, even now, years later. It all started when my dad built the treehouse in the summer of my 11th year. It was a small but sturdy wooden structure perched high in an old oak tree in our backyard. It was my escape, a space just for me where I could read, draw, and dream. But as autumn came and the days grew shorter, the treehouse took on a different vibe. The playful hideout became a shadowy, eerie silhouette under the moonlight. And it was during one cold December night that everything changed. That night, I was in my room staring out the window. Snow was falling steadily, blanketing the yard in white, and the treehouse stood dark and still in the distance. The air felt heavy, as if the quiet was holding its breath. I was about to turn away when I saw it. A light flickered inside the treehouse. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. The treehouse had no electricity, no light source of any kind. But there it was, a faint, warm glow pulsing against the frost-covered glass of its small window. I told myself it must have been a reflection, maybe from the streetlights. But the more I watched, the clearer it became. The light wasn't random. It was moving, slowly, almost deliberately. It shifted from one side of the treehouse to the other, like someone was walking with a lantern. I called out to my dad, but he shrugged it off as my imagination. Probably just the wind or some snow glare, he said. But I couldn't shake the unease growing in my chest. The next morning, I decided to check it out. Snow covered the ladder leading up to the treehouse, and the cold bit at my fingers as I climbed. Inside, the air was frigid, and everything was as I had left it. Books scattered on the floor, a couple of old blankets folded in the corner. But something was off. Near the far wall, there was a footprint. It was faint, like someone had stepped there with bare feet. The sight made my stomach churn. Who would be up here in the middle of winter without shoes? I backed out quickly, telling myself it was just some prank, maybe left over from the summer. That evening, I decided to stay up late, watching the treehouse from my bedroom window. I wanted to see if the light would return. Hours passed and nothing happened. But just as I was about to give up, I saw it again, a flickering, shifting light coming from inside. This time, I grabbed my flashlight and jacket, determined to get answers. The backyard was eerily quiet as I trudged through the snow, my breath visible in the icy air. As I reached the base of the tree, a strange sense of dread washed over me. But I forced myself to climb. The treehouse door creaked as I pushed it open, and the beam of my flashlight swept over the small space. It was empty, just as it had been that morning. But then I noticed something on the wall. Scrawled in jagged, uneven letters was a message. Asterisk, don't come back. Asterisk. The handwriting was rough, like it had been scratched into the wood with a sharp object. My heart raced as I backed out of the treehouse and practically ran back to the house, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words etched into my mind. When I finally drifted off, I was jolted awake by a tapping sound at my window. At first, I thought it was just the branches swaying in the wind, but as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. A figure was standing in the yard, staring up at my window. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could see the faint outline of its face, hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I stared back, but eventually, it turned and walked toward the treehouse. The light inside flickered to life once more, glowing faintly through the frosted window. The next day, I tried to tell my parents again, but they dismissed it as a nightmare. "You've been watching too many scary movies," my mom said, shaking her head. But I knew what I saw. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. I'd hear footsteps outside my window late at night, faint whispers coming from the direction of the treehouse. Once, I even found a handprint on the frosted glass of the treehouse window, too large to be mine. One night, I woke up to the sound of creaking wood. It took me a moment to realize the sound was coming from the treehouse. I peeked out my window, and my blood ran cold. The figure was inside the treehouse, but this time it wasn't alone. Several shadowy figures crowded the small space, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. They moved jerkily, like puppets on invisible strings, and their whispers grew louder, almost like a chant. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, the light inside the treehouse flared brightly, illuminating the figures for a brief moment. Their faces were twisted unnatural, their mouths stretched into wide, hollow grins. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the light went out, plunging the yard into darkness. The next morning, the treehouse was gone. The oak tree still stood tall in the backyard, but the structure itself had vanished, leaving behind no trace. No debris, no nails, nothing. When I asked my dad, he said he had no idea what I was talking about. "We never built a treehouse," he said, looking genuinely confused. To this day, I don't know what happened that winter. The treehouse, the figures, the light. It all feels like a terrible dream. But every now and then, when I look out into the yard on a snowy night, I swear I can see a faint glow coming from where the treehouse used to be. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear whispers carried on the cold wind. Treehouses are supposed to be a haven for kids, a place where imagination takes flight and the outside world disappears. But for me, the treehouse in our backyard was something I wish had never existed. It started as an innocent summer project, but ended as the darkest chapter of my life. It was early December when my dad decided to build the treehouse. We had just moved into the countryside, eager to embrace a quieter life. The house itself was charming, rustic and surrounded by towering oaks and dense woods. One tree in particular stood out, a massive oak with sprawling branches. My dad immediately claimed it as the perfect spot for a treehouse. The construction was quick. By late October, the treehouse was finished. A small wooden structure perched high in the oak, complete with a ladder, a trapdoor, and a tiny window overlooking the woods. My younger sister, Lily, and I were thrilled. It became our sanctuary, where we played, read books, and sometimes even camped out on warm nights. But as winter approached, the treehouse began to feel different. The first time I noticed something was wrong was during one of our camping nights in late November. Lily and I had brought sleeping bags and a lantern, ready to spend the night telling ghost stories. The wind howled outside, making the trees sway gently, but inside, we felt safe until we heard it. A faint tapping noise. At first, I thought it was just a branch knocking against the treehouse, but when I looked out the small window, there was no branch anywhere near us. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Lily. She nodded, her wide eyes reflecting the dim lantern light. I mustered up the courage to open the trapdoor and shine my flashlight down the ladder. Nothing. The snow-covered ground below was empty. "Probably an animal," I said, trying to reassure her, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. We eventually fell asleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The real terror began a few weeks later. It was early December, and the first heavy snow of the season had blanketed the ground. I hadn't been to the treehouse since that night, but one afternoon, Lily begged me to take her up there. Reluctantly, I agreed. As we climbed the ladder, I felt a strange sense of unease, like we were being watched. Inside, everything looked normal at first, but then Lily found something, a drawing scratched into the wooden floor. It was crude but unmistakable, a figure with long arms and hollow eyes standing beneath the treehouse. "Did you draw this?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head. "No. Do you think Dad did it?" I didn't answer. My dad wasn't the type to joke around like this, and the drawing felt sinister. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the treehouse. The tapping, the drawing, it all felt connected, but I couldn't make sense of it. Then, just past midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. Creaking wood. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the treehouse ladder, as if someone was climbing it. I crept to my window and pulled back the curtain. The treehouse was lit from within. It was a soft, eerie glow, like candlelight. But I knew for a fact there was nothing in the treehouse that could produce that kind of light. And then I saw it. A shadow moved inside. I ran to my parents' room, but they dismissed my concerns. "It's probably your imagination," my dad said groggily. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the treehouse until the light finally went out. The next morning, I decided to investigate. Snow covered the ground around the tree, undisturbed except for one thing: footprints. They were large, far too large to belong to me or Lily, and they led directly to the treehouse ladder. Worse, there were no return footprints. Inside the treehouse, everything looked as it always had, except for one chilling detail. Another drawing had appeared, scratched into the wall this time. It showed the same hollow-eyed figure, now standing inside the treehouse. From that day on, strange things happened regularly. Lights flickering in the treehouse at odd hours, faint whispers carried on the wind, and that constant, rhythmic tapping. Lily became terrified, refusing to go near the treehouse, and I couldn't blame her. One night, the whispers grew louder, almost insistent. I finally decided I had to put an end to it. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I climbed the ladder. The moment I opened the trapdoor, the air inside felt wrong, heavy, cold, and charged with something I couldn't explain. My flashlight beam swept over the interior, and that's when I saw it. The drawings were everywhere now, dozens of them, all depicting the same hollow-eyed figure. Some showed it standing by the treehouse, others climbing the ladder. One even showed it staring into a window, my window. I was about to leave when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from right behind me. "Get out." I spun around, my flashlight flickering, but the space was empty. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. I scrambled down the ladder, almost falling in my haste to get away. The next morning, the treehouse was gone. I don't mean it was torn down or destroyed, it had simply vanished. The massive oak tree was still there, its branches bare against the winter sky. But there was no sign of the structure that had been there just hours before. My dad was baffled. "Maybe the wind knocked it down," he said, though we both knew that didn't make sense. There was no debris, no broken wood, nothing. It was as if the treehouse had been erased from existence. But the footprints remained. In the years since, I've tried to convince myself it was all a dream or a trick of my imagination. But every now and then I hear it, the faint tapping sound like footsteps on wood. And when I look out into the yard on cold, snowy nights, I sometimes think I see a faint glow where the treehouse used to be. I don't know what it was, or why it came to us, but one thing is certain. Some things are better left unseen, and some places should never be revisited, because sometimes they don't want you to leave.